What's up, DS3 TV? We are going to watch something recommended to me by a subscriber, Monster Man, The Bureau. It is an actual like 3-part series, but we are going to watch the first episode, and I think this is the first episode that I saved, and like to my watch later. So we're gonna watch that, and yeah. Let's get into it, and subscribe to the channel. I want to get 2,000 subscribers by my birthday, September 13th. Also, follow my Twitch. Link is in the description down below. Also, recommend videos in the comment section down below, because your recommendations will I will watch and react to. So yeah, let's get into it and play.
Francisco Goya's aquatint The Dream of Reason Produces Monsters depicts the artist asleep while various predatory animals gather around him, perhaps in his dreams? The picture illustrates Goya's fears about society. Put simply, the sleep of reason produces monsters. But it plays with a simple idea that dreams aren't simply the things that appear when the conscious mind is absent, but they form around reasonable and rational ideas processed by the subconscious, and furthermore, that our nightmares come from things that we have good reasons to fear. One of the reasons that we tell stories is to create monsters. We create monsters to warn each other against common threats or unite against common enemies, to live out the fantasy.
Love the earrings, by the way. Love the necklace. Everything here is immaculate. The penguin like background. Love it. Loving everything.
See of revenge against the unjust, or sometimes just for the simplest reason, to get a little fright. It can be thrilling to spook yourself out, boo, etc. This is a new series looking at why we tell monster stories, where they come from, and what they mean. And today I'd like to start with a monster that's fascinated us all for decades, the serial killer, and the famous team of pioneers in the field of catching serial killers, the FBI Behavioral Sciences Unit.
Huh, that's an interesting. It's gonna be an interesting look, I think. I do love looking into obscure parts of the FBI. You know, that's an entertaining time.
When it comes to the niche strain of media representing the FBI Behavioral Sciences Unit, and also in the broader cultural phenomenon of serial killer media, two properties are absolutely vital. One being Hannibal, originally a book series by Thomas Harris, adapted to screen multiple times, first as Manhunter starring Brian Cox, most famously with Silence of the Lambs, and most recently with the TV series simply titled Hannibal. Hannibal Lecter is a spectre that haunts serial killer fiction. Hannibal Lecter, more like Hannibal Communism. Hannibal the Cannibal is a seminal character for many later stories and tropes.
Yes, we love Mother Russia.
And directly informs the cultural common idea of the serial killer monster. He's essentially the platonic ideal of the serial killer. And it's no surprise, since elements of his appearance, behavior, character, and crimes were inspired by real-life famous serial killers. Even the main thrust of the plot is inspired by the real-life instance of Ted Bundy helping the FBI psychologically profile and later catch the Green River Killer. Hannibal is the charming, intelligent, deeply evil but deeply brilliant psychopath. And so it's no wonder that decades on, we're still fascinated with him. Dr. Lecter is, simply put, too powerful to be kept strictly within our analysis here, so although I'm going to repeatedly reference various versions of Hannibal, he will be getting his own episode later in the series. Which brings us to the second piece of media that should never be overlooked in discussing the BSU, which is of course David Fincher's true crime series Mindhunter. Mindhunter is a fictionalized history of the Behavioral Sciences Unit based on the book of the same name by real-life FBI profiler John E. Douglas. And what's really interesting about Mindhunter is that while it is true crime, the crimes are true and they really happened, it mostly follows a fictional story loosely based on Douglas's account. This episode, by the way, is going to primarily be about policing, psychological profiling, and the Behavioral Sciences Unit, rather than the violent crimes themselves, but I will still need to discuss the cases of several serial killers and their crimes, so those particularly sensitive to the topics of murder, violence, and sexual assault, proceed with caution.
I could see that. I could definitely see that, yeah. I understand what you mean. I'm like, it's mostly dramatized, but it's mostly dramatized, but like the actual crimes did happen.
Special Agent Holden Ford, based on Douglas, whose passionate belief that psychological profiling can be used to stop violent crimes drives the development of the BSU and much of the plot of the series. Holden and his partner Agent Tench struggle to revolutionize the stuffy and conservative FBI and meet resistance at every turn, eventually allowed to start their venture into this fringe science but consigned to the basement of the Quantico headquarters. To some degree, this is accurate. The FBI was created to track booze smugglers during Prohibition and tackle cases of mail fraud, which doesn't usually get much attention because it isn't exactly sexy. Its evolution into this sort of mythic super cop organization, as it's portrayed in things like Hannibal, should always be deflated by remembering its history of serving the conservative political establishment and making sure letters go to the right place. The FBI...
Yep. That is something that should be looked at very hardly.
Also sent letters to Martin Luther King telling him he was gay and should kill himself, best described in the Chapeau Guide to Revolution as the last known instance of liberals knowing how to troll. To some degree, painting the establishment as crusty and conservative is only in Mindhunter, however, to make us root for the young, up-and-coming progressive cop, the good cop, the hero cop.
Yes, the new cop, he is gonna change and revolutionize the FBI.
The belief that serial killers, cannibals, et al. Are monsters that exist outside of humanity lets them off the hook for their actions. Or actually, more importantly, it lets us off the hook. We don't need to reconcile a morally just world with the morally repugnant actions of serial killers if we rely on the simple explanation. They're crazy. What Mindhunter sets out to do is break down that mythology by showing the real people and examining their individual psychology. Individual psychology, however, also has limits. In the second episode of Mindhunter, in one of the earliest striking moments of the show, Ford goes to interview Edmund Kemper, a serial killer and necrophiliac who beheaded his own mother, and finds that Kemper is a polite, calm, genial guy. The real Edmund Kemper is reportedly just as jovial and eager to please, and even lent his voice to a bunch of audiobooks while in prison. Despite being a deliberate anticlimax, it's a really shocking and effective moment, but this first case...
I would love to do like a video series, kind of like Rob. Sorry the battery went out again, but what I was saying was I would love to make a video series with kind of like doing like a serial killer's files like type vibe. If you never watched like Rob Dyke, I would probably like do something like that, but just like just like with like infamous killers and like just kind of like infamous things and stuff. I always want to do like a kind of like a series or a show like that. Might make another poll about it and see what you guys think about some of those ideas, because I'm really thinking about it. But yeah, let's keep going.
Also starts to show the cracks. Kemper, even besides being an early interview, was a good choice to open the show with. He has quite a unique affect, even among serial killers. As Douglas writes in The Killer Across the Table,
though his victim suffered horribly, he wasn't motivated by sadism, as many serial killers are. What he told us he was doing, and this isn't a phrase I've heard before or since, was evicting them from their bodies so he could possess them, at least temporarily, after death.
Now, of course, Kemper is, obviously, to put it simply, a pretty messed up guy, and both the real agents and the fictional ones in the show benefit from being men interviewing him, since he's almost incapable of being around women whatsoever. It certainly gets the message across very effectively.
I mean, but you gotta think about it too. He's in prison, so it's kind of like, I mean, most serial killers and like people that have killed that are like psychopaths, they don't feel. So it's kind of like they don't, like they can talk about it pretty much normally. And if they're a sociopath, they can talk about it normally and probably like be cool, like, and kind of be chill and like kind of laugh with you and stuff. Like they'll probably be okay to talk about stuff.
But it's a complicated fiction. Kemper's example breaks down the perhaps common idea that serial killers are so mentally ill that they can't understand reality or control themselves moment to moment. Or as Douglas puts it,
we operate from the premise that anyone who commits a violent or predatory crime is mentally ill. This is almost ipso facto in that normal people do not commit such crimes. But a mental disorder in and of itself does not mean that the perpetrator is insane, which is a legal rather than a medical term, which has to do with culpability.
The reason the monster of the serial killer is so fascinating to us is that they represent a contradiction. We want to believe they are an insane monster which simplifies their character to a pure, uncontrollable evil, but we also find a morbid fascination in the idea that they are rational, self-interested, potentially likable, and at least semi-normal people. It's easy to see from where a public appetite for a character like Hannibal Lecter arises. People want their serial killers to be charming, scheming masterminds. Later in the book, Douglas writes,
if there is one word that I found that survivors of murder victims detest, it is closure. The media, the public, well-meaning friends, and even the judicial system itself often feel that this is what all grieving loved ones are seeking, so that they can put this behind them and get on with their lives. But anyone who has experienced a murder knows that there is no such thing as closure, nor should there be.
I mean, that they can't, nobody's going to get on with their lives with it after the death of a loved one. That just doesn't happen. So I never really understood that when they say that, like in news stories and stuff too.
This idea of closure is not for people who have real experience of serial killers. It's for us. We want the monster story to have an ending, so we can just put it away and move on. On August 9th, 1969, white supremacist doomsday cult the Manson family gained international infamy after 4 of their members murdered movie star Sharon Tate and 4 of her friends. The cult members whose long-term goal was to incite a race war and thereby subjugate people of color wrote "pig" in blood on the walls of the crime scene in an attempt to either frame the Black Panthers or, to paraphrase the cult's leader Charles Manson, to teach black people how to start a race war. Now you may well be asking,
Sophie, Sophia, why are we talking about Charles Manson? He's a cult leader, not a serial killer. He didn't even kill those people himself.
To which I'd say,
Pshaw, come on, just vibe with me, Sib. They talk about it in Mindhunter. Why can't they talk about it here?
the episode of Mindhunter is interesting and intense. In the interview, as was apparently true in real life, Manson sits up on the back of a chair so he can talk down to agents Ford and Tench. In Killer...
I mean, yeah, I heard like Manson was basically like that in
Across
jail
the table,
too.
John Douglas actually describes deliberately recreating this height differential with another later subject to let his interviewee feel more in control of the interview. The cinematography deliberately plays with this preacher pose using point of view. The camera is low when looking at Manson, and on the reverse it's high looking down at Tench and Ford. This tells us that what Manson says is true and shouldn't be questioned, so afterwards as Ford unravels the interview and realizes that Manson was manipulating and lying to them, we're realizing that too. This isn't the only time Fincher uses perspective to manipulate the audience, but we'll get back to that later. Manson tells them in the interview that his entire race war story was made up by journalists. One of his followers, Tex Watson, tells them it wasn't. But at the end of the episode, the BSU sit around chewing over the interviews and land on the conclusion that Manson's entire public justification is nonsense. He doesn't want to start a race war, he isn't a white supremacist, etc., etc. It's about control, it's about manipulation, it isn't about white supremacy. This really bothers me because, well, Charles Manson was a white supremacist. Even if his outward justifications were some kind of...
I mean, his outward justifications could have been different, but yeah, he definitely was. Like, it doesn't change the fact that he was.
Still used them to build a cult following, and his followers were still acting based on white supremacist doomsday cult logic. Someone who builds a cult based on racism is still a white supremacist. It's a bit like Douglas's ipso facto justification for mental illness in serial killers. You don't just make a white supremacist cult because you're a woke king. Also, there are some curious details, like this strange symbol tattooed on Manson's forehead. What does it mean? We may never know. Douglas highlights in his writing how some serial killers...
Wait, you're telling me nobody knows whether, like, that symbol was tattooed on his forehead? I would have thought, like, somebody would have found that out. Like, I just always thought it was like a Nazi symbol or something. That's literally what I always just thought of it as.
Nazi or other racist groups because they are a hateful and violent mission statement, especially one that's self-aggrandizing and tells them they're more important than other people, and that's very appealing to them. It makes sense, but it also pokes a big hole in the individual psychology approach to criminology. Like, if our intention is primarily to catch killers more than to understand their internal machinations, clearly white supremacy is still something worth addressing. In Atlanta, Georgia, between 1979 and 1981, a series of boys, teenagers, and men went missing, all of them black. These disappearances, generally dubbed the Atlanta child murders, are a pretty messy case.
Why was it the Atlanta child murders if it was, like, kids and men?
From a few angles. First off, the main drive to connect the murders came from the families of the dead, and as such the exact numbers of murders considered part of the pattern ranges from 28 to somewhere over 30. There are therefore a lot of other things that are hard to pin down, primarily the number of perpetrators. In 1981, Atlanta radio broadcaster Wayne Williams was stopped by police after a surveillance team heard what later turned out to be a body being dumped in a river, and asked where he was going. He provided a fake name and phone number of a friend he was allegedly visiting. When interviewed, colleagues said they'd noticed Wayne with scratches on his face and arms around the time of the murders. Ultimately, Williams was only convicted of 2 of the murders, the body he'd been dumping when the police found him and one other, but Atlanta PD closed the other cases, attributing them to him. In Mindhunter, the coverage of this case deliberately plays with uncertainty and ambiguity a lot. Agent Ford comes in insisting the killer is black because of the psychological profile. Serial killers usually murder within their own race, while the black community are sure they are
I mean, that's not always true. It could have been a race thing. I mean, it's a possibility. I don't think that just because it's not always, just because it's a less likely possibility doesn't mean it's not.
Motivated crimes likely committed by the KKK. After the conviction, despite having been so confident, Ford is still a little unsure of whether they've caught the right guy. In real life, Williams' case is the subject of much debate. In 2006, Williams' attorneys pushed for retrial on the basis that police were allegedly covering up evidence of KKK involvement in the killings, but the push for retrial was dismissed by a judge.
Nice. I mean, you know.
In 2007, however, Williams' hair was tested and found a DNA match to one of the hairs found on both bodies. John E. Douglas has said that he's confident that Williams is the perpetrator. However, a report in 2005 found that a KKK member called Charles T. Sanders had praised the crimes in secretly recorded conversations, had told a police informant that the killer
had wiped out 1,000 future generations of N-words.
And according to an anonymous source who claimed to be a former friend of Sanders, Sanders actually claimed he and his brothers had committed some of the murders. The same anonymous source alleged that Sanders was really pleased he had the same type of carpet and breed of dog as Williams because it was that fiber evidence that forensics teams had used to convict Williams. They said of the fact the killing stopped when Williams was arrested.
Once it was pinned on Wayne Williams, they were through. That was their way out.
Sanders was an early suspect, but Atlanta PD let him off after he and his brothers passed lie detector tests, and after that, the FBI profile led the direction of the investigation. So did psychological profiling help find the killer, or let one walk free? There are big troubling aspects to individual psychology as it's portrayed in fiction as well. The Hannibal franchise has been plagued by horrible anti-queer garbage since the very beginning, and it seems pretty clearly inspired by an amateur serial killer fan's shallow understanding of psychology. There are places where this can work really well. For example, Francis Dolarhyde, the eponymous Red Dragon of Harris's first book, is a really compelling fictional killer. The details of Dolarhyde's psychology, character, and crimes were directly based on the then uncaught BTK Strangler, and the obsession with William Blake's The Great Red Dragon and the Woman Clothed in Sun was Harris's own invention. That's just a really good, compelling character. However, when you get on to Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, things critically fall apart. Buffalo Bill is primarily based on several serial killers, and one of them, Jerry Brudos, was arguably transgender, although it's complicated because Brudos was schizophrenic and a misogynistic serial killer who clearly had some baggage around gender. I can't be clear enough about this. The overwhelming majority of serial killers are cis straight men who kill women based on the deeply misogynistic.
Yep, but just that one will change a lot of people's opinions. Could have even changed some people's opinions on this video, which will be stupid. Don't just think because you've seen one that means all. That doesn't make any sense.
Worldview.
Don't be stupid.
The fact that Harris felt the need to focus in so sharply on queerness can only be explained with bigotry. The fact...
That is if you're that one that believes that
J.K.
that's
Rowling chose to base her serial killer in Troubled Blood on Brudos can only be explained with bigotry, but if you wanted to know J.K. Rowling hates trans people, you could just look at her Twitter tantrums. Queerness, and especially transness, keep popping up again and again and again in serial killer stories, despite, once again, the vast majority of serial killers being cis, straight men. Hannibal Lecter is bisexual, Buffalo Bill is supposedly a failed transsexual, and in the third book of the trilogy, Harris introduces a character called Margot Verger, who is presented as a lesbian, but Harris hints that she's on testosterone and has Clarice Starling speculate on Margot's genitals because Thomas Harris has a creepy obsession with trans people. It needs to be said, and said again, Thomas Harris has a harmful and creepy obsession with trans people. Fuck you, Thomas Harris. Margot is presented as going on testosterone as a response to a sexual assault, because Harris is clearly aware of transmasculine people, but understands them even worse than he understands transfeminine people. As to Buffalo Bill, it's one of the most harmful possible constructions to have characters profile Bill as a failed trans woman, especially one who would have been rejected by doctors for medical transition. Trans people have to go through an agonizing process of self-doubt and fear because of stigma like this that makes them feel absolutely petrified they'll be outed as a fake trans who isn't actually trans but just mentally ill. The gatekeeping of medical transition by cis doctors who often don't understand trans people very well at all is actually a really serious issue, and treating rejection by doctors as concrete proof that someone's a fake mentally ill trans person is actually, to use the technical term, fuck you, Thomas Harris. I think this really shows where individuals
double time. Fuck you,
psychology
Thomas
falls
Harris.
short. Like, on the one hand, looking at a society that oppresses and stigmatizes queer people and saying to ourselves, the sleep of reason produces monsters, maybe you would draw the conclusion that the few serial killers who aren't heterosexual or cisgender might have failed to process some internalized bigotry. On the other hand, taking the queerness of a serial killer on a purely individual basis, you can only really conclude that for someone who murders women and dresses in their clothes, their queerness is sort of the explanation of their sickness. It naturally breeds transphobia. Furthermore, any fear-mongering about fake trans people is only there to attack trans people generally, just like how any focus on fake refugees is just an excuse to drum up racism. As for John Douglas, on whom the Hannibal character of Jack Crawford is based, he said he really enjoys Silence of the Lambs.
I haven't heard anything about fake refugees in a while.
Dean's performance of Bill in particular. This does make me feel dubious about Douglas's grasp of psychology, frankly, but mostly, I read this as Douglas being a big nerd for FBI serial killer stories. He's clearly very invested in the job he did for decades and the science of criminal profiling, and I think it's not a huge reach to say he's a little blinded by the flattery. He actually pointed out in an interview with Jonathan Groff how nowadays the FBI receives tons and tons of applications for people wanting to do his exact job. I think we can treat a lot of FBI media as de facto BSU media to some degree, for the simple fact that before the BSU became famous for studying serial killers, the FBI was just so unfuckably boring. Twin Peaks, for example, features an FBI detective coming to investigate the latest victim of a serial killer and using confusing and mystical methods to determine what happened and who did it. This is where serial killer fiction takes a fantastical turn. In a typical episode of The X-Files, Mulder and Scully go to a place where a series of strange events, possibly attacks on people, have been taking place, and rely on a fringe science that most people don't agree with and see Mulder as a crank for believing in, to profile and then track down whatever is causing the events. Fox Mulder even works in the basement office of the FBI, which is the literal, physical place that BSU worked out of. I think it's a pretty compelling reading of the X-Files as representing a fantastical version of the behavioral sciences unit. It's not as interesting to see X-Files as intentional allegory, though, especially as such a long-running Monster of the Week story. That interpretation doesn't necessarily imbue it with much fresh meaning. Instead, I think we should imagine the reasons for this similarity come from a cultural trauma and intrigue.
Am I on an LSD trip? What is that? What was that? What was that little montage?
Although serial killers existed long before, they really came into the public consciousness in a big way in the 60s, 70s, and 80s with what seemed like an epidemic of serial killers like the Zodiac, Ted Bundy, and John Wayne Gacy. It might even seem strange that something...
Which, if you don't know, the Zodiac killer just got caught last year, so... That's crazy, and they found he's dead, so that's
like Mindhunter wasn't made sooner given the public fascination with serial killers. But in a certain way, the fantasy and science fiction version is the much more predictable response. It's been noted a lot before how Godzilla served as displacement fiction for the people of Japan after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and how much American fiction after 9/11 served the same purpose. Huge sci-fi catastrophes destroying either New York or New York Light became the go-to for Hollywood blockbusters. And that's displacement fiction too. This is related to what Goya was depicting in The Sleep of Reason. Goya lived through times of war and political turmoil in Spain that led him to feel more and more disenfranchised from the political and social mood of his time. Throughout his life, his work took on more and more of a fantastical nature while still depicting madness, suffering, and isolation. It seems that he gradually worked more and more to depict the social trauma he was so hurt by, not as literal events with real people, but with witches.
That's the one I remember, though. The last one got, I think that was what was it? Zeus eats Jupiter. No, it was like one of the Titans eating one of the gods or something like that. I just remember that.
Witches, animals, gods, and figures of folklore. So, similarly, I would argue that X-Files and things like it served as displacement fiction for the public awareness of serial killers and the people whose job it is to hunt them. One supernatural bureau that could be understood as doing the same thing is the Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense from Mike Mignola's Hellboy franchise. Mignola's art, clearly inspired in style by Goya, uses gothic fantasy elements to tackle real-world concerns. Now, the BPRD through its publication history has primarily served as a different kind of displacement fiction. The main series really took off in the early 2000s, with the stories revolving around enormous Lovecraftian monsters tearing apart American cities. And so for a large part, BPRD serves as displacement fiction for 9/11, terror attacks, the fears about US national defense responses. But the Bureau was first conceived by Mignola in 1993, and I think in its original, much more X-Files-y incarnation, it can be understood as another version of the Basement Boys, the BSU. The team are a highly secretive and specialized task force? The team are a highly secretive and specialized task force, just like in X-Files, using their
It's fine, same difference. They'll still come after you if you need
unknown science
if you don't have their
to
money.
battle the forces of evil. And crucially, the team is made up of either people imbued with magic or magical creatures, which feeds into a common idea throughout all forms of FBI and serial killer fiction. That the people who hunt monsters start to take on the magical qualities of the monsters themselves. In Control, yes, more Control videos are coming, you hogs, don't rush me. Jesse Faden gains more supernatural powers as she progresses through the world of the FBC and becomes more mired in the magical and unseen reality that exists on top of the normal one. The story leads us toward the conclusion that the power used to battle against the Hiss is the same power that led them here in the first place, and furthermore, that this power is an evil and corrupting influence. This trope follows the logic of Friedrich Nietzsche's famous aphorism, that when one gazes into the abyss gazes also, which people like to quote a lot, so it must be really smart and meaningful. It's a very romanticized aspect of this kind of crime fiction, that gazing into the abyss will somehow deeply change you. And to be clear, it isn't simply about the detectives. David Fincher uses a lot of POV shots in his work. In fact, more than are usually actually feasible. He doesn't just do POV shots that are from the perspectives of his characters, but shots that treat the camera, and therefore the audience, like an invisible person moving through the scene as well. In fact, in Mindhunter, I would say nearly the majority of shots utilize the form. The show absolutely wants to let you feel like you're being sucked in as well. This is one of the big appeals of serial killer fiction. If you watch the show about the scary knife boy who do a stab, you're also kind of a scary, edgy knife boy. 1976 and 1977 found New York City gripped in terror as a series of attacks were carried out by a serial killer known as the Son of Sam. Son of Sam particularly hunted dark-haired young women who he would shoot with a .44 caliber handgun, after which he would disappear in the ensuing chaos.
Oh yeah, I do remember hearing about that. That's a serial killer I do remember.
The killer taunted police and journalists with letters detailing how his father Sam abused him and insisted that he kill and drink blood. At the end of one of the letters he says,
Please, let me haunt you with these words. I'll be back. I'll be back. Yours in murder, Mr. Monster.
When David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, was eventually caught, he remarked to police, "What took you so long?" and generally seemed to express a sincere relief at having been apprehended and later sentenced to life in prison. He would first claim that Sam was his neighbor's dog who was sending him telepathic messages instructing him to kill, before later admitting to profilers that this was a hoax and he was deliberately pretending to be schizophrenic to throw off the police. Post-arrest, Berkowitz was allowed to talk to the press, closing with a statement that,
"There are other sons out there. God help the world."
which some read as evidence that he wasn't working alone. Berkowitz, it turned out, was ex-military and viewed the streets as a war zone and felt this compulsion to patrol them until he found the right go. With this in mind, and with the American government commonly referred to as Uncle Sam, it seems kind of odd that this is a prominent focus that Berkowitz was ex-military. His relief at being captured seems to speak to a strong comfort derived from the security of institutions, which would also align with him finding Jesus in prison in later life. Berkowitz's childhood showed some signs of potential trouble, such as starting fires, but he didn't suffer major abuse or trauma in the same way as the archetypal serial killer. According to psychologists, it was David's discovery that he was adopted that shattered his identity and sense of self. Here, it might be interesting to consider the role of the army, an institution which happily imposes its identity onto young, impressionable recruits, and actively seeks out people who feel lost and directionless in life. Why it's recently started recruiting gamers. The uncomfortable thing here is that the identity of soldier may have been Berkowitz's mold in which he formed Son of Sam. Which all leaves me with some questions. How many serial killers have we never even noticed because their murders are state-sanctioned? How many crimes have gone unconnected into a pattern because they're hate crimes or police brutality? How many sons does Sam have? It feels like psychological profiling of violent criminals is a...
It's a very good question, because it's definitely got to be more than what you're even thinking now.
Sleight of hand, which puts mental illness at the absolute forefront of what makes serial killers kill. It makes monsters out of the mentally ill, particularly the schizophrenic, those with dissociative identity disorder, and in a lot of cases treats queerness like a spooky mental illness too. It's so strange that it puts sexual obsession, bad relationships with mothers, dressing in women's clothes, and misogynistic violence right in our faces, and yet we're never asked to consider misogyny as a social issue. One spurious theory as to why Dennis Rader became the BTK Strangler that John Douglas details in Inside the Mind of BTK is that Wichita was founded by this cruel colonialist who, searching for the city of gold, tortured a Native American slave to get more information out of him. And ever since then, Wichita has been a haunted place that turns men cruel and violent. Okay, I mean, it's obviously nonsense.
I mean, I definitely feel like that's nonsense. I mean, the BTK killer probably happened way after that Native American got tortured. I'm just gonna say that that's probably not the truth. I don't think that all people from that specific city that he came from would be bad. That can not be possible.
But you could draw a line between the violence in society then and the violence in society now. Moreover, if you're going to talk about Dennis Rader's mental health, his fixation on women, his fetish for causing them pain and suffering, and not talk about the deeply misogynistic society we live in, you might as well go with the theory, maybe a spooky ghost turned him evil with magic. An answer that stories won't give because stories are about dramatic tension is perhaps to form a society that doesn't produce serial killers. In Madness and Civilization, Michel Foucault details the history of...
But I thought that was it's like something that was going to happen anyway, though. Like, even if people could be treated like completely right as a child, they could still get they could very well still become a serial killer just because of how a person's circumstances could turn out.
Sanatoriums and mental institutions and how they removed the mentally unwell from society, a practice previously very unusual. Now, if you've read any Foucault, you can probably guess ahead that he goes on to compare this to a prison. I think this is a pretty interesting comparison, especially as policing in general treats criminality so much like a disease, and psychological profiling quite literally merges criminality and mental illness into one thing. As Foucault points out, before the sanatorium, people with poor mental health simply existed in and amongst the rest of society. We can see something analogous in the contrast between the evolving militarized modern police force and the methods of community policing, conflict resolution, mediation, etc. that people practiced for thousands of years beforehand, and even that indigenous groups still practice today. In The End of Policing, Alex Vital writes about how some places are moving to adopt replacements to policing that are inspired by indigenous practices. Reductive and flippant opposition to this idea might say something like, right, so we're just supposed to have violent killers live with us. And there are a few things to consider about this point. Firstly, it takes a village, right? Or to explain better and take the crime as disease metaphor a little further, maybe individual psychology is just treating the symptoms and not the cause. Secondly, we already have violent killers live amongst us. The common mythology of the police is that they have to be tough to deal with the bad people. To fight the monsters, you need to become a little monstrous. Sometimes when you gaze into the abyss gazes also, right? But how does this...
Grossman gives his police training lectures on how to become more comfortable with using lethal force against criminals. He calls this killology. That does not sound good, but alright.
Killers really commonly seek out positions of authority and power, either in the military or police or any lower station they can achieve. Ted Bundy was a lawyer, BTK and Son of Sam were in the army, BTK was a city code enforcer who would whip out a ruler and measure people's lawns to insist they mow them. He would force people to euthanize their dogs unnecessarily for the sick power trip. How do we reconcile the idea that we need big scary monsters to protect us with the apparent trend that this just attracts more monsters? In Inside the Mind of BTK, Douglas talks about a woman called Kimberly Comer who, from the moment she moved to Park City until Rader's arrest a year and a half later, was horribly harassed almost daily by Dennis Rader. While she was unloading her moving truck, he pulled up and told her her washing machine needed to be moved inside or he would give her a ticket.
I feel like the big thing too, like dealing with somebody like Dennis Rader, is the fact that